Good afternoon, everyone. Tom Nagorski, I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Asia Society. I'm always reluctant at this event, frankly, to get things started because I know there's a lot of great people in the room who are having great conversations, but at some point we do need to get to the matter at hand, which is one of our longest-standing traditions here at the Asia Society in New York, the awarding of the Osborn Elliott Prize for Journalism on Asia. This is the 16th year that the prize is being given. It is known increasingly these days as the Pulitzer for Asia, and as well it should have a name like that when you think of the individuals and institutions who have been honored in the previous 15 years, the work they've produced. I think it's fair to say they do justice to the name Pulitzer and certainly justice to the name Oz Elliott, who we celebrate also here today. We note every year, and it's always worth repeating, a champion of good journalism, a champion of journalism for good, and a man who was known widely as a phenomenal editor, a great human being, and a really global citizen. Oz Elliott was also a trustee of this institution, the Asia Society, so we are proud to be stewards of the prize that bears his name and the hosts of this great annual occasion. I want to welcome, before we get underway, some special guests who are with us today. We have, I mentioned 15 prior years, Barbara Demick, 2006 Oz Elliott Prize honoree. We have trustees of the Asia Society with us, I believe at table one, Agnes Shutang and Denise Saul. Great to have you. And at my table down here, Janet Ross, longtime champion of our Arthur Ross Center on U.S.-China Relations. Janet, always great to have you with us. And, of course, delighted, as always, to have in the room Oz Elliott's wife and a really true friend, longstanding friend of this institution, Inger Elliott. We couldn't do this without you. Other members of the Elliott family here, Cynthia Elliott and also Dinda Elliott and Alec McCabe, right up front here, who also both serve as members of the jury that works. Well, we never really get into the jury room, so I don't know, but I know you work long and hard each year, and we thank you. We don't normally do what I'm about to do, which is review the bidding a little bit from the year prior, but there are two good reasons to do so. Those of you who were here last year will recall that our 2018 honorees for the Oz Prize were the two Burmese reporters from Reuters who had been jailed for their work. And so for the first time in the history of the Oz Elliott Prize, the winners could not be here to claim the honor, which was accepted in their absence by other members of the team from Reuters. There they are. We said 1 year ago that it was, of course, our fervent hope and wish that the award and the event here might shed some small light, meaningful light, and add some element of pressure on the authorities in Myanmar to free those men. And you don't need me to say it's a travesty that it took as long as it did. And we at the Asia Society claim no more credit than all the other organizations in civil society and in the media who did so much to shed light of their own, but how pleased we were just 2 weeks ago today, and how pleased I think it's fair to say Oz Elliott would have been to see the moment when the two reporters, Walon and Jo So-u, were set free. They said that morning that they could not wait to get back to their children and to their newsroom. And so we thought we'd pop that picture up on screen because that is taken just the other day in the Reuters bureau in Yangon, the two men with their children. I mentioned two items from a year ago. Last year's Oz Prize runner-up was Rappler Media, the ever-growing organization in the Philippines. And Rappler's CEO, as you may know, and you'll hear more in a moment, has had her share of stress and trauma in the year since. Maria Ressa, co-founder and CEO of Rappler Media in the Philippines. She was a long-time reporter for CNN before that, established Rappler in 2012, began actually as a Facebook page and evolved very quickly to become a major, respected news source, not just in the Philippines but beyond. She has incurred the wrath of the authorities in her country. She's been arrested several times. If I have it right, Maria, you've had to post bail 7 times just in the past year or so, and on charges and accusations that are widely seen as politically motivated. Maria Ressa has been an outspoken critic of the Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte. She has won multiple honors for her work, and so it's a great pleasure, a bit of a coincidence, but a very happy one, an honor to welcome Maria here today. And we thought only fitting to ask, given the occasion, before we move on to the presentation of the 2019 prize, to ask Maria Ressa to say a few words from her own unique perspective about the need for great journalism, not just in Asia, but throughout the world in these times. Please welcome, from Rappler, Maria Ressa.
I'm not going to tiptoe. Tom is so tall. The Valentine's Day gift of my government to me is allowing me to post bail after arresting me for the first time. In 5 weeks, I was arrested twice, detained once. It's actually 8 times that I've had to post bail in 3 months. And from January 2018 until for 14 months, from starting January 2018, the Philippine government has filed 11 cases and investigations against me and Rappler, and our only crime is to speak truth to power. The runner-up was our impunity series on the drug war last year, and there are 2 levels of impunity that we're fighting in the Philippines, and it's very similar to many parts of the world. The first is in the drug war. The UN estimates there's about at least 27,000 people killed in the Philippines since July 2016. And the second level of impunity is familiar to Americans. It's the exponential attacks and lies on social media, right? The pattern is very clear in how journalists, activists, lawyers are attacked. It's bottom-up, astroturfing, lateral, transfusing it into media, co-opted media by the state, and then finally top-down by President Duterte himself. These were the attacks against Rappler, against journalists. Most recently, a month ago, Rappler, along with other independent news groups, were on a list. They called it the Matrix. We supposedly are plotting to bring down President Duterte. I've run out of synonyms for the word ludicrous. It's this. This is what we all have in common, regardless of which country in the world you report from. Exponential attacks on social media are very personal. Your organization can no longer protect you from that. And you say a lie 1,000,000 times, that lie is truth, right? And that's really it. That's kind of the virus that's going through all of our democracies. When the lie becomes truth, so without facts, which is what journalists are really the gatekeepers for that, without facts, we don't have truth. Without truth, we don't have trust. And I think that's our biggest challenge. That's this battle for truth. And increasingly, we are all under attack in many parts of the world. I think, I don't want to take up more of your time except to say these are all battles that require not just courage and not just from journalists, but from everyone who is on social media. The social media tech platforms have taken away the gatekeeping powers of journalists, and we need to demand that this poison, the virus that is infused into the body politic, that is weakening democracies around the world, that this poison be taken out. I won't mention Russia. I'll just end with this one thing. This shows us how important the mission of journalism is. It shows us how important independent journalism is and how digital journalism needs to not just learn from tech, but take from tech and force tech to take the gatekeeping responsibilities. We are going to have to do it with them. So congratulations to both the Asia Society for 16 years and to the winners this year. I think more than ever, the world needs investigative journalism, and it's our survival of our democracies. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to embarrass her just ever so slightly, but you know a former television professional, when she asked us out there and said, how many minutes do I have? And I said, 3, 4, 5 minutes. And a person who's been on television as often as Maria has, if it's 3 minutes, it's not going to be 3:01 or 3:02. It's going to be 3 minutes. Okay. Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you for being with us. Now, as I said, to the honors for the 2019 Osborn Elliott Prize. We here don't make the choices. As I said, we're not in the jury room. That's handled by a really blue ribbon group that does this work each year for us and for the Oz Prize. The jury chair is Marcus Brauchli. Marcus is managing partner at North Base Media. He was executive editor of the Washington Post and at the Wall Street Journal, held a similar title just before that. He also spent 15 years as a correspondent and bureau chief in Asia and Europe for the Journal. So we have here someone who knows a thing or two about first-class, meaningful, and impactful journalism. Please welcome, to take us to the prize this year, Marcus Brauchli.
You know a print guy because he brings something written down. Every year it's a great honor to be here and celebrate the extraordinary quality of journalism being done in Asia, and not just by big international organizations, but also by local organizations or national organizations like Maria's. You've just heard from Maria. I've known Maria since 1998, more or less. We spent a lot of 1998 together in Indonesia. It was the end of the Suharto era. Maria's ambition has always been to produce high-quality, agenda-setting journalism, to bring a sense of civic duty and community to her country, and she and her team really have done that. And for their work, as you've heard, they've attracted a series of ever more bizarre legal actions and digital slanders by the government of President Duterte and his cronies. We are actually, my company is one of Maria's backers, I should say, and it's a special honor, I have to say, to be regularly attacked by the pro-government lapdog press in Manila. It's a privilege, Maria, to stand alongside you. Rappler practices the kind of authority-challenging, fearless journalism that we recognize every year. It's heartening not just to see the rise of local journalism, though, but the redoubled dedication of global news organizations. Big international news organizations employ scores of journalists in Asia's major economies, and that number has gone up and down as governments have changed their tolerance for journalism and as the economics of media have changed. But I would say news organizations globally are deeply versed in the cultures and languages of the countries they cover these days, and able to see and report stories of immense complexity and importance. The Oz Prize jury this year reviewed more than 50 entries in selecting our winner. As usual, there were plenty of stories of human exploitation, environmental destruction, and the clash everywhere of tradition and modernity. But there were also original, often compelling stories about interesting new subjects: genetic experimentation in China, sexual harassment in Bollywood, women in the Afghan armed forces, and, if you want a little scary with your coffee, monkey malaria. One series that stood out to us was by a New York Times reporter, Mujib Mashal, an Afghan native. He produced moving personal accounts of the continuing devastation in that country on families and villages wrought by this endless war that continues, whatever it is, 18 years after the attacks of 9/11. And the jury felt that his work deserved to be this year's runner-up, and we were pleased that it was, and we're grateful that New York Times has a presence here, and Arthur Sulzberger, the chairman of the company. So first, I'd like to thank them, congratulate the winner, the runner-up. Well, thanks, Tom. To this year's winner, as some of you know, I spent many years covering China. 30 years ago this month, you will remember, it was the run-up to what we know as the Tiananmen Square massacre. Students were gathered in Tiananmen Square, and it was a very serious, abrupt, brutal end to a period of some opening in the 1980s. But by the time I moved to Shanghai in 1995, things had sort of become more open again. I used to joke that they hadn't so much developed a free market economy as a free-for-all economy. If you were in Hong Kong, you could buy a black market visa in Kowloon and be shopping for pirate luxury goods in Shenzhen by lunchtime. In 1999, I wrote a story about the rise of the China Democracy Party, the same year that Falun Gong protesters surrounded the leadership compound in Zhongnanhai. China felt very loose and in flux. As I said, so much has changed. The Associated Press today fields one of the finest teams working in China today, but they, like the people of China, are up against a technologically empowered security state that is anything but loose and in flux. China's leader, Xi Jinping, is controlling and every bit as prickly, insecure, and audacious as the U.S. president. Last year, the AP's China journalists took great risks and applied deep knowledge to expose China's massive security state. They relentlessly and compassionately wrote about the vast detention system in Western China. They explored how technology is being used to control society, and they painted a portrait of a modern autocracy bent on absolute control. And so for their exceptional reporting, I'm pleased to announce that the jury awarded them the Osborn Elliott Prize, and I'd like to ask you to join me in congratulating the AP for that project.
So there remains one more introduction for me to make. Well, actually, Yanan Wang, the lead reporter on the series, Marjorie Miller, executive editor at the Associated Press, and, oh, did I just give you a promotion?
No, you just gave my boss's title.
Oh, okay. See, Marcus, you were supposed to do that, so this is, I can.
Sorry.
We have one more great journalist to call to the stage, and he's our moderator today. Edward Wong is diplomatic and international correspondent for the New York Times, based in Washington, although that beat takes him, well, you never know where you're going next, Edward, I know that. He reported for 13 years before this post from China and Iraq for the New York Times and served as the paper's Beijing bureau chief. He's a terrific journalist, a great speaker. He's also a great moderator, and he'll moderate the conversation with our honorees and leave some time before we break for questions from the group. Ed Wong, great to have you back at the Asia Society. Come on.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out today, and thank you for coming from Beijing, and congratulations, and thanks for coming a few blocks from AP headquarters. Well, first, I think that this issue, the issue around the building up of surveillance and the detention system in Xinjiang is a very complicated one for a lot of people around the world to get their heads around. And as people who spend time in China know, Xinjiang is a vast territory in the far northwest of China. It's often not on the radars of most people who think about China. So I wanted to start off the conversation by asking how we got on the radar of the journalists at the AP, and what were the roots of this line of reporting for the AP?
So first of all, I want to thank the Asia Society for this honor. I think pretty soon they'll be saying that the Pulitzer is the Oz Elliott of the United States. And to say that this is what we do. We go to the far corners of the world. We go to the United States. We try to write about immigrants in America and war in Yemen and what's happened to the Rohingya and what's happened to the Uyghurs. And so it's our job. It's our mission. And it was on our radar for a long time because it's been going on for a long time. And we had a very, very bright bureau chief in Beijing who left for some obscure publication that I can't. She went to the New York Times. Jillian Wang.
She's an editor in Hong Kong now for the Times.
Who had been, had a lot of experience and had been covering this issue for a long time and realized that the government had pretty successfully blocked access to the West, and that this story was uncovered. And so she was very, very smart about thinking about how to get it. It was on our radar. It was just that we didn't have access and how to get at it when we couldn't very easily get on the ground. And so I think it was her idea, along with the reporters, to start working the exile communities, which is what we do, of course, with North Korea and the Rohingya and other places. But I think that's how and where it started. And so that got it onto the radar.
Right. And can you tell me a little bit about the resources that the AP is able to bring to bear on a story like this? You say starting with the exile community, so that means outside the borders of China.
Right.
Given the AP scope, what are some of the resources you can mobilize when you're doing a story like this?
So the first resource is money, because we can't do any of this without money. And fortunately, the AP, under Sally Busby, who is the executive editor, and Ian Phillips is the international editor, the company is very committed to these projects. And so there's a lot of planning that goes into it and a lot of resource mobilization of people, because, of course, we do it for not just print, but video and photos. And it requires a lot of travel and coordination. We're lucky that we have people based in all of these countries, so we can rely on a local infrastructure, and we can also rely on our enterprise and investigative reporters, who are separate units, and we mix them on a story like this. So it does take a tremendous investment, and to go to Turkey, to go to Kazakhstan, and to work with our business reporters in the United States on the case of electric cars, and bring together, I often say it's like trying to get all the legs of the beast going in the same direction. That's sometimes as hard as getting the resources.
In total, how many reporters, editors, and photographers and other sort of journalists at the AP worked on this series of stories?
Well, there were the 10 primary reporters and photographers and video journalists who were listed on our contest entries, but behind them is a huge team of editors, photo editors like Mei, Mary Rajkumar, who is our enterprise editor based in the United States, was the primary editor on this project. The regional editors, I suppose that, there were 10 on the list, and there were probably another 20 behind them.
Right. And I think just for the benefit of the audience here, we could maybe set the scene a little bit about what changes policy-wise were taking place in Xinjiang, right, around 2016 to 2017 or so, and why you started seeing this in Beijing, like how the reporters in Beijing were able to see this and then realize this was a line of reporting. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so 2016 is when Chen Quanguo arrived in Xinjiang as party secretary, and he'd previously had the same role in Tibet. So he was sort of known for these more hardline policies, especially in enacting a very high-tech security state. And around the same time, reporters in Beijing were hearing reports of people who were more, not so much political figures in Xinjiang, but they were intellectuals, people who were involved with ethnic studies and things like that, who had previously been considered, completely harmless in the eyes of the state, or at least they hadn't had as much trouble with the authorities, and they were suddenly being cracked down upon. So when we talked to exiled Uyghurs, for them, a lot of them felt that that was a sign to them that they were broadening the crackdown to include not just people who were really considered extremists, but a wide range of people. And that was around the same time that a lot of our interviewees fled the region. Right.
And even going back before 2016, like for the Chinese government and the Communist Party, there's a very complicated relationship with Xinjiang. And can you just tell us a little bit about sort of why they have particular concerns about this area and about the ethnic Uyghurs there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big event in the recent history of it were the Urumqi riots in 2009, which Ed reported on himself, where there were violent protests and a lot of members of the Han Chinese majority were killed as a result of these And I think
Or just
that
say
was-
the majority
sorry.
in other parts of China, but not,
they're
not
sorry.
the majority in Xinjiang.
They're the
right?
majority in other parts of China. In Xinjiang, we have the Uyghur ethnic minority, which is a predominantly Muslim ethnic minority, which is the subject of our series. And so I think it was during this time that the leadership started to become more nervous about how they could control the region. And you would also see attacks cropping up, for example, the train station attacks. And so we see a progression starting from that point up until the part that the events that we are talking about in our series, where there's definitely, you can see the beginnings of this internment camp program. We've spoken to people who, prior to this time, they were sent into they were sent to study, but they didn't have to stay in a camp or anything like that. But you can see that it was definitely beginning and then started to be put in full force dramatically in 2016.
Right. Can you tell us what these camps are like? What are they like, and how do people get rounded up and put into them?
Yeah, so physically, if you're trying to visit them, which is very difficult, especially as journalists, you can see that they're surrounded by barbed wire. There are these enormous compounds, and there's extremely high security, not just around the camps, but really anywhere in Xinjiang currently. There are checkpoints everywhere as foreigners, and especially as people holding journalist visas. We're constantly stopped to show our ID and passports, and we're also followed, basically, from the moment we arrive.
And so, Marjorie, you were saying that the line of reporting started by trying to approach Uyghurs who were living in exile overseas. How did that first come about? Did reporters from the Beijing Bureau travel outside of Beijing to talk to people, or did it start with bureaus overseas?
No, they traveled outside to build those sources starting in 2016. And as Yanan explains, I think the more the crackdown intensified, the more people were willing to speak openly in exile, because many of them didn't know where their family members were, where their children were, whether they were alive or dead. So they wanted to bring the problem into the open, and they also thought maybe that if they weren't on the record, they could get some help in finding some of their families or finding out what had happened to them. But that was just the first step, an important first step. But we used all kinds of techniques. I mean, basic shoe leather reporting, as she's talking about, going to the places as they were able to do, not for very long, and using data journalism, using procurement records, using satellite digital photography, or satellite images of the building that was going on in the camps. And I wanted to, Erica Kinitz is one of the other journalists, and I was asking her about, she actually did this other piece in it about how electric car data is being gathered by the government there, and how it's being used for surveillance, and people worried that it'll be used to a much larger degree. And she said, when I asked her about her reporting, she said that she learned about this government collecting and monitoring center from a guy at a dinner party, then gradually found other people who had seen a presentation about it. We managed to get it into the data center through the wife of a friend who introduced me to another guy, who introduced me to another guy, who put in a good word for us with the deputy director. So I think that's not to be minimized. That luck is a big factor in journalism always. I think there's lucky journalism, there's unlucky journalists. You want to hire the lucky ones. And secondly, I think that part of the reason all these governments in China and elsewhere want to keep us removed from people and keep people from talking to us is this. They don't want us to have a friend of a friend of a friend who might talk to us. So I think good old journalism,
And we talked about shoe leather reporting. You took trips out to Xinjiang. How did those trips first come about? Were you hearing information from Uyghur exile sources that then prompted you to go to certain parts of Xinjiang?
Yeah, exactly. Like Marjorie was saying, we were actually quite surprised in that in the process of reporting this package, there was a shift in the attitudes of the interviewees in that they were much more willing to talk.
These are the exiles.
Yeah, and the exiles. And part of it was because a lot of them had seen the initial video of Omar Brauchli, the first story in the series that details his experience in the internment camps. And I think it was also, sorry.
Oh, maybe we should talk a little about Omar Brauchli and what that story was about.
Yeah, so this was a story that my colleagues, Jerry Shi, Han Guan, and Dake Kang worked on, and they traveled to Kazakhstan to interview a Kazakh citizen who is originally from Xinjiang, who found himself ensnared in the camps, and he spoke in detail about his experience, and I think it really illuminated for everybody what it's like actually inside, and also spoke to the goal of these camps, which is to rewire one's thinking and to have one's faith in perhaps a religion be replaced with faith in the Communist Party.
And then some Uyghur exiles saw that story and the video that accompanied it and started going on the record about experiences that their family members had gone through?
Yeah, exactly. That was something that we did when we were in Turkey. We asked them if they had seen the video. Almost everyone had seen the video, and then we said, well, actually, Dake is the one who shot this video. So for them, it made them feel more comfortable with the idea that having your story out could at least help people become more aware of the issue. And I think another part of it was that, which is a very devastating part of it, was that a lot of them hadn't heard from their family members for months, maybe more than a year or even more than that. And for them, they just felt so helpless sitting in Istanbul or somewhere else. They felt like speaking out, showing their face to the cameras was a small thing that they could do for their family members.
And what were specific pieces of information you heard from them that prompted you to make your trip to Xinjiang?
A lot of them wanted us to, for the family separation story, where we focused on what the plight of Uyghur children and what happens to them if their family members are detained. We focused on schools, boarding schools and orphanages, where some of these kids might be now wards of the state. And a lot of the people actually, they wanted us to be able to go to these places, so they would tell us the names or the addresses if they had them, of these institutions. And they really just wanted us to see what it was like. We were also very curious ourselves. And it was interesting because sometimes you would find a place it's called a kindergarten, but then when you did more research or looked into the procurement notices or looked at the government reports about this kindergarten, you would find out that it's actually for what they call orphans. Even though these are children who have parents who are just, they don't feel like they can return to China.
And what was your experience of traveling there and reporting on the ground there like? You told me you made 2 trips out there. Can you tell us a little bit about those trips? And physically and security-wise, what's it like?
Yeah. So I spoke a bit to our photographer, Han Guan, about this. He is the most experienced among us in traveling to the region. He's been there 5 or 6 times prior to the trips that we made for this package, and he feels that it's been progressively worse in terms of the conditions that reporters face. So both times that we went there, basically, we arrived at the airport and we had a welcoming committee from the local authorities, and they're always very polite and very professional. They say that, oh, you've arrived in Xinjiang and we're here to assist you in your reporting, and you should tell us, what you're working on so we can help you. And they offer us drives in their car and just plenty of hospitality. And then, so basically from the moment we arrive, we are followed by at least 1 car. And there are a bunch of interesting scenarios that we came across, because you can see that the local handlers are trying very hard to be professional. There are members of the propaganda department who are also, they're PR professionals, so they don't want to look like it. They don't want to make it appear like it's so stifling. And at one point we were taking photos and someone suddenly appeared on the scene to say that he was a concerned citizen, and he said that he had seen us taking photos and that it was an infringement of his privacy rights. And he had this really long monologue about privacy rights and how it wasn't right for us as reporters to take pictures of him without his knowledge. And we asked him, well, where are you in these photos? And he would go through all of our photos. He said we had to delete all of them, and he said, this is my brother, or this is my place of work, so you have to delete it. And so they had all of these different interesting tactics to work around the idea that they were actually trying to obstruct our reporting and making it appear like there's someone who claims to be a concerned citizen who.
And is the experience of reporting there, running into these obstacles, very different than reporting elsewhere in China?
Yeah, I think it's extremely different. One of the things that is really tough about it is that we don't feel safe speaking to anybody on the ground because we're aware that we're being followed, and so anybody who would be talking to us would likely face government retribution. So in other places where we're going there to talk to people on the ground, to have interviews, that's completely different in Xinjiang because it's just not safe. And for us, the trips to Xinjiang were more about trying to understand the security apparatus ourselves and to look at these institutions and to judge for ourselves whether it was fair to describe them in certain ways.
And when you were going around there, were you able to get close to some of these internment camps, and also the places that were holding children who had been separated from their parents?
Yeah, in certain cases we were able, and you can see from the photos, we were able to go to the front gates, basically. We weren't allowed to go inside. And we were basically immediately stopped once we got close.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what was the most valuable information you were able to gather, given the tight circumstances under which you were reporting there?
I think it was really valuable just to experience the atmosphere of fear and also to witness for ourselves what this whole security surveillance system is like, because it's extremely comprehensive, and it doesn't really matter if you're a clear target, although we were as journalists, because if it's a grocery store or a gas station or anything, they have checkpoints, they're checking your identification, and we saw in the police stations that they have an app where they request people to connect their phones to this device, and it appears that then scans your phone for anything that could be considered harmful or sensitive. And so those are all things that we had heard about, but it was really different to actually witness it ourselves and also be a part of that.
And as you were traveling through these different cities, were you able to see sort of the electronic surveillance method, sort of like cameras or other facial recognition technology that was being deployed in these areas?
We could see in the police stations that there would be people monitoring it was like a huge screen with multiple screens taken from different angles of the street. Yeah.
And what, when you're thinking about ways that this technology might be used elsewhere, is that one line of reporting that that editors and reporters are also sort of concerned about sort of pursuing? Other ways in which this technology might be used?
Yeah, I think that's something we're very curious about and we're pursuing in our next line of reporting, because I don't think it's possible to really replicate that exact type of security apparatus because it costs a lot of money, I'm sure, and it's also it requires a lot of manpower because there's still a lot of police on the ground. They're not just relying entirely on the technology, but now that they have built up this system, it will be interesting to see if it's applied to other parts of China or even other parts of the world.
When people ask me what it's like to report in China, some people often have the question whether it's a police state and the restrictions on journalists. But I always answer it generally is, and we actually have a lot more freedom to move around and to talk to people than maybe some outsiders think. But it sounds like in Xinjiang that's not the case right now.
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of other parts of China. I think we're mostly free to move around and we don't experience these kind of limitations. Xinjiang is very different from my experience.
Can I just add one thing to that? I think what we are seeing is, I think, as Maria raised earlier, that as governments continue to, criticize the press, label the press the enemy, especially the foreign press, it is, again, getting harder to have people talk to you, regular people. And so just in the last week on another story in Shanghai, we had people who had previously agreed to go on the record or on camera on a story pull out. And I think it is this effect of, well, it could hurt me, or they could come after me for doing this.
And on that question of sort of government attacks on the press, I was wondering, while these series of stories were coming out, was there any pressure being applied to the AP by officials within China, or even sort of representatives of the Chinese government here in New York? I know that there have been previous instances where, diplomats might approach publishers or editors and ask them to pull back on the reporting.
Well, first of all, in the course of reporting, every step of the way, we make every effort possible to talk to the Chinese government and get their point of view in the stories. So we don't spring these stories on them. They know we're doing them. They know because we've asked questions. They know because they've been following us, but they know. And Ian, I'm not aware of any diplomatic pressure after this, no. I mean, the pressure is on the ground when we're reporting. The pressure is, in the past, I think, in 2016, I think they had, for the first series that Jerry did, I think they were spoken to, but not in the last year and a half or so. Maybe they're more sophisticated now.
And then you also broadened the series to look at how this fit into the global economy, sort of how the camps and also some of the forced labor that was going on in Xinjiang were integrated into the chain of manufactured goods that went to the U.S. and other places. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So it's always been a challenge with international reporting to make readers in one country, or viewers, or what, care about another country, and not to make these crises not feel far away. And one question I always have for editors and reporters I'm working with is, why will they read this in Ohio? Why will they care in Ohio? And I think one key way is to show them that because their lives and their consumer products and their businesses are not divorced from these practices, that and we've done this before with the slavery in the fishing industry, that ends up on your table in the United States, and you cannot claim that you have no part of that, or that's something bad going on in the rest of the world, because it's why your seafood is inexpensive. And similarly with this, we found that some of these factories where the Uyghurs were essentially working for free and weren't free to leave in every case, that they were producing sportswear that was ending up on U.S. campuses. And so that's very effective in trying to make change in the labor practices and make change in the purchasing practices. People have consumer power. That's the power that they have. And similarly on the automobile industry, I mean, the Chinese government was requiring international automobile companies to deliver their data to this government monitoring center. And ostensibly it's used for, I forget what it's ostensibly used for, but it's
to improve the safety of the vehicles.
Right, but it's also used for improving electric vehicles that are made in China. And then the potential there, and some believe it already is being used as a kind of monitoring, because it can tell you, the government, where you went in your automatic, your electric car. So these are international car makers. So they are complicit in these practices. So it's always important, I think, to tie it back to the market, to the producers and to the markets.
And it seems that the Chinese government line on this detention and surveillance system has changed in the last couple of years. Can you tell us a little bit about what they said about the camps at first and how it's evolved, or whether even they were willing to acknowledge the camps' existence at first?
Yeah, I think it's to the credit of not just our bureau, but all of the China bureaus who have worked on this story to shed light on really what the situation is in Xinjiang, that the Chinese government is now openly talking about it and presenting their own narrative. So what initially occurred was that there was just silence in terms of responding to these reports. And then they said there's no such thing as re-education camps. And now their narrative is that these places are vocational training centers designed to give people who are poor or more susceptible to the lures of extremism employable skills. So they're taught vocational training so that they can go ahead and find jobs and not be absorbed by these extremist groups. That's what the government is saying now. It's contrary to things we've heard from people, for instance, the exiled Uyghurs who have family members who are very well educated. We have people saying that their family members are doctors and professors, and it doesn't make sense for them to be going through vocational training if they're already highly skilled. But at least now the government is addressing some of the reporting that has been brought out. And actually some foreign outlets have been invited to go on tours run by the government into what they say are these vocational training centers.
And what are they finding from those tours?
They're finding that, of course, everybody that they interview says that they're there voluntarily and they're happy to be there. However, it seems like everyone is reciting the same lines, and that I think there was one report from Bloomberg that said that what they're called students, they can recite the lines repeatedly, word for word. And so you can see that it's very hard to still parse out the truth, even if you're able to enter one of these centers, because you have to do it with the guidance of the government.
And from your reporting, what was actually happening in these centers? On a day-to-day basis, what would people be doing?
According to the former detainees that we've spoken to, a large part of it is repeating the idea that they should be grateful for the party, that they should be grateful for President Xi, and that they should be grateful for what they call the motherland of China. And so you can tell that they're really trying to erase the idea that Xinjiang and the people of Xinjiang can have a separate identity to what we see in the rest of China.
And are there restrictions placed on their practice of Islam? Most of the Uyghurs are Sunni Muslims. What kinds of restrictions are being placed on that, if there are any?
What the former detainees have told us is that they're not allowed any sort of religious practice inside the camps.
And once they leave the camps, or for people outside the camps, are there also restrictions on the way they practice Islam?
Yeah, what people have told us is that because there is this camp system in place, there is a constant fear that anything you do might be construed as religious extremism, and then therefore you would be sent to a camp. And so everybody there feels like they're being very closely watched. They're scared to pray. They're scared to have a Quran around with them. They're scared to go abroad because there have been reports of people being detained immediately after going abroad to countries like Turkey.
Well, there's also, talk a little bit about the relatives in your home.
Yeah, so they have a program where they bring together Uyghurs and Han Chinese cadres. So they're mostly lower level local party officials who will come inside these homes and actually live in the homes with the Uyghur family members for a set period of time regularly. And so the purpose of this program, according to the government, is to promote ethnic unity and to promote understanding between the different ethnic groups. People who have experienced the program tell us that it's basically like having an informant inside your home, because they would report on where they're going out, they would report on their family members, their social activities, and they would just feel like they're constantly being watched.
How did you hear about that program, and how did you go about reporting it out? It seems like it wouldn't be something that would be well known among a lot of people outside of Xinjiang.
That was also from our trip to Turkey, where we spoke to a woman whose family was experiencing life within that program. And she was in a unique position in that she was actually still able to talk to her family members. So through more cryptic messages, they were able to convey what their life is currently like in Xinjiang. And so she considers herself lucky because her family members are not detained. However, she says that they continue to live in fear because they have someone constantly visiting them. She even said that these visitors would time their visits to the regular prayer times to check on whether they were praying.
And are they coming from all over parts of China, like the ethnic Han, lower level or mid-level officials, or are they mostly coming from within Xinjiang?
It seems like they're already based in Xinjiang, but there are a lot of Han migrants and a lot of Han people who are brought in from other parts of China to work in Xinjiang as local cadres.
Right. Yeah. And on the question of children being separated, I know that this was a big concern for a lot of the exile sources you met, and they wanted to find out what had happened to children in their families. Were you able to find out any specific details related to any of the exiles with whom you spoke?
Yeah, here is where it was actually very helpful for us to comb through government notices. There's actually a surprising amount of information that you can gather from government notices where the government is saying very explicitly what their programs and policies are about. And like Marjorie said earlier, it is really important for us to get the government's perspective and to understand where they're coming from. So from these notices, we could see that there were policies in place specifically for children whose parents had been detained. And there was even one notice we found where it acknowledged that a lot of the families are reluctant to part with the children because they don't trust the state-run kindergartens or schools to properly educate them. And that was presented in the government notice as a hurdle that the government needs to overcome, and that they need to overcome the reluctance of families to be separated from their children.
And these notices are available on website, on regional government websites or county-level government websites?
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And then I know you also did a story related to policies on Christians in China. And I wanted, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the general direction of religious policy is within China right now under President Xi and how the Christian story fits into that.
I think the Christian story fits into the broader theme of the series, which is about control and how the party is attempting to insert itself into every aspect of people's lives. With the Christian story, we were looking into Sinicization, which is a campaign under President Xi to give all of the major religions Chinese characteristics. And so essentially the idea is that it's fine for people to pray, it's fine for people to be Christian, but that must be subsumed under the idea that the party is the key arbiter of how people should live in China. Yeah.
And where did you go to report that story?
That was much easier than the Xinjiang reporting because we principally went to Henan province, which is one of the most populous provinces in China, and it's also home to the greatest number of Christians. And there are a lot of people who have been Christians there for many generations. So it was really great to hear from our sources that we met on the ground who had a really generational view of it, in that they had experienced being able to practice their religion much more freely after the Cultural Revolution and after religious freedom was written into the Constitution. And it was only in February of 2018 when the religious regulations were changed, and that they felt there was a sudden crackdown where police officers would go door to door and tell people that they have to stop worshiping, they have to take down any crosses or religious language that they have hanging on their doors, which is very traditional for that part of China. And even for so for people who don't know the background, there are in the Protestant churches, there are what are called house churches, which are not government approved, and then there are the official government churches. And the house churches previously had also been allowed to basically be built up really big. We could see in these places there are enormous churches. And so it wouldn't be right to say that they're underground churches because they're very much out in the open. And it was because they were out in the open that these Christians believed that they had the government's tacit approval to keep going. And what we heard from them when we went to Henan was that suddenly they were being told that they can't practice there anymore and they have to have everything go through the official churches. And even we also spoke to people who were involved in the official churches who said that they had to shut down their Sunday school programs because it was no longer allowed for them to have minors in the church. And so even if you're an official church, they were definitely experiencing a turn in what they were allowed to do.
So I'm sure there are many questions about this fascinating line of reporting. I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. And if before you ask a question, if you could tell us who you are, that would be great. And you can stand up when you ask the question.
Thank you. I'm Edith Lederer, the Associated Press Chief Correspondent at the United Nations. I have two questions. First, what long-term impact do you think that this series is going to have on the Chinese government? Because initially, certainly it was quite embarrassing, and they've now changed their stories several times. Do you think it'll have any longer-term impact on their policy toward the Uyghurs? And you spoke also about these kindergartens for children. Did the team ever get to go visit any of these places and perhaps even get to talk to any of the kids? Thank you.
It has been really interesting to see how the government has gone from being silent on this topic to presenting their own rhetoric and narrative, and also a really aggressive PR push for them to present the centers in a certain way. And I think there have been some positive changes as a result of all of the work from media organizations. For instance, we had an article out about how the Kazakhstan government says that 2,000 ethnic Kazakhs have been or will be in the process of leaving Xinjiang to settle in Kazakhstan. So you can see that things are happening behind the scenes, even though Kazakhstan has never publicly spoken or condemned the camps. And an official from Xinjiang said at the recent 2 sessions political meeting in Beijing that one day they hope if there will be no more need for these centers, then they will be shut down. And so I'm not sure if we can really hope for more than that from the government, but it seems like at the very least there's progress in terms of people talking about this more openly, and at least even having a debate about whether this is a policy that should be enacted at all. And, you mentioned the kindergartens. Yes, we did visit one of the kindergartens because one of our sources, who is one of the main characters in the story about family separation, she had the name of the kindergarten, and the kindergarten actually happened to be mentioned in several of the government notices, so we had more information on it, and we were able to be at the outside of the kindergarten and at least see the facade, which is quite interesting because if you see in the video that my colleague took, it appears to be replicating a castle. It has like these mini turrets and it's very colorful, but then it's surrounded by barbed wire. So it's really interesting imagery. And when we were there, the propaganda official told us that, you know, there are a variety of children who are kept in here. Some of them might even be orphans. And we weren't allowed inside. The principal insisted that, you know, this is just a regular kindergarten. There's no point of going inside. Yeah.
You're in the middle.
Elliott, obviously related to Oz. I have a question about the separation of children from the parents, and I think it's very interesting what you've been telling us today, and wondering if any sort of anything has been done to look at the separation of children from the parents here in the United States in comparison to what's been going on in China. or if there is any such thing proposed?
That is an ongoing body of work. We did quite a bit of it last year. That work actually was a Pulitzer finalist, and we did everything from a toddler alone in court to following children back to their homes, to be reunited with their parents who were deported earlier. We've looked at the conditions of children who were separated from their parents earlier and almost ended up adopted. We're looking at the conditions of how they're held in centers and also what's happening now to either children who are here, who are U.S. citizens but their parents are gone, or looking at the continued separation of families. So we do that, but that's a whole other team.
Here in front, Barbara.
Hi, thank you. Barbara Demick from the LA Times. I recently heard some Uyghur activists saying that people who went into these camps weren't coming out, or weren't coming out very promptly. And I'm wondering if that's also what you've heard. And again, following up on what Edie asked, what is the long-term plan for these up to 1 million people who have been detained?
That's one of the most terrifying aspects of it for the families, is that they don't know if their relatives are being held, if they will be released. How the government says that it's just a temporary program and everybody will eventually, what the government says is that everyone will graduate from the programs. We have been hearing more reports of people being released, and part of that could be the government trying to reassure people, given that there's more attention on this issue now. And people are really incredibly relieved to hear when their relatives have been released, but they understand that they're still living in incredibly stifling conditions, and it's not really possible to know at this point the extent of freedom that they have when they are released.
There's one question from Lauren on social media, and I think this speaks to the bigger sort of political picture in China right now. She asks, is this an attempt by President Xi to hold on to power based on paranoia and fears of things happening outside of Beijing? Is it an attempt to hold on to power based on the idea of Han chauvinism? I was just wondering whether you have thoughts on that.
I think part of it is definitely, as we see with the other attempts to exact control over the population, it is an attempt to control people, and more specifically in Xinjiang and related to the family separation, we can see that there's the assimilation of the Uyghur children, for them to adopt more of a Han identity and for them to enter what is called the Chinese mainstream. Because when we look at how Xinjiang is presented in some government documents, it's considered a less modern society, and so the officials say that these policies are in place to bring people into the modern world.
But isn't there also, there is a sort of desire to homogenize the culture and the people, but the West is a particularly important economic region and important on the resources and geographically on the Belt and Road, isn't that right? So they have many reasons for wanting to do this.
It's China's link to Central Asia, and so it is very important on the Belt and Road.
At this table here?
Yes, my name is Grant Yuji Fusa. I'm a member of a national group once interned in this country. My question for you is, if I were an official in Beijing, would I think that this program is working, that the re-education is working?
I wish I could know what the officials in Beijing are thinking. That's something
What do you think? Is it working?
Do I think it's working? What?
Like I come out re-educated.
Actually, what a lot of analysts and experts and psychologists are saying is that this is going to create a lasting psychological trauma. And it also has the potential to radicalize people who were very much supportive of the party. We hear reports of people whose parents were actually working for the government for their entire careers, and then they retired, and then they were sent to a camp. So these are people who previously did not have any animosity to the party, who are now suddenly sucked into a system that gives them reason to feel like it's infringing on their freedoms.
Here in the front. Hey.
Hi. Mei Fang here. Quick question. We see it also here in this country as well as in China, but the idea of reproduction for control has been a long-tried tool. And there's been stories for a long time about the fact that traditionally in China, minorities like Uyghurs were allowed to have any number of children and were not subject to the China's family planning policies. But there was some talk very recently about controlling that as a method of controlling that society and reducing that. Is there any indications of this that you see?
A few people that we interviewed who now live in Turkey said that because they had maybe 4 or 5 children, they said that police would often raid their homes under the pretense, or maybe that was the actual reason, they said that they were investigating how many children they had. So that was actually one of the earlier reasons some Uyghurs feared the police, is because they felt that they would be found out for having so many children.
That table right there.
Okay, Wang from... Okay. Wang from the Chinese Council in New York. Okay, since I stay in the United States for quite a few years, so my observation is that Western media is like a watchdog, not only watching Donald Trump administration, but also watching other country government, no matter how far away it is. My observation is that media much interested in human rights cases, individualism, and a lot of very interested in stability, social political stability in other countries. So my question is that the Western media reporting Xinjiang news, and did they miss something? My observation is maybe. And most of your report are on human cases, especially vocational training center, something like that. Did you miss the first part of that? You know, from 2009 to 2016, many terrorist attacks in Xinjiang happened. 100 policemen lost their life. 1,000 people, innocent people lost their life. And the Chinese government take very soft measures at first, but it didn't work. So 2016, it's a turning point. Take a harder measure to make some changes.
Thanks. So let's Grace has a question.
Maybe the third part is also missed, is aftermath of the so many measures. And perhaps you already observed that 2.5 years that no terror attack happened in Xinjiang. And the majority of people supporting the government policy, harder policy toward Xinjiang. Okay, this I'm observation. So I'll ask you, did you miss something when you're reporting the whole Xinjiang situation? Thank you.
I think if you read our reporting, we always do mention the violent incidents that have occurred in Xinjiang, and we definitely acknowledge that that's something that's taken place. And ever since the government has spread the line about the 2 years without any violent incidents, we have also included that in our reporting. So we definitely make every effort to share that perspective and have the government perspective in there. What was the third part of it? That people support it. It's really hard. Right, so I just mentioned that we've included that in our reporting, that the government has stated that there have been no violent incidents for 2.5 years. And we would very much like to be able to gauge what the Chinese population thinks about these policies and how they feel about it. If you have any suggestions for how we can do that.
At the center table here.
My name is Agnes Xu Tang. I'm an archaeologist. I worked and lived in Xinjiang, in fact, rural western part of Xinjiang in 2002. I think I can say on behalf of many of us whose academic specialty is in Central Asian studies, we want to thank you for bringing this story to the world. For those of us, I was living there in 2002. Many of us who worked in Xinjiang and Central Asia had sensed, we did not know for certainty, but we had sensed that there was a level of fear in that region. And if I may speak from the American academic perspective, what we are fearing is that the Uyghur culture is being successfully obliterated. To give you an example, it's much easier to learn Tocharian, which is the ancient language on the Silk Road in this region, than it is to learn Uyghur in this country. So I want to thank you sincerely for what you have done, and I want to ask if you, I think goes back to the previous question, is our fear of this obliteration a realistic one of culture? And I'm addressing the cultural heritage component rather than the political component.
I think it's hard to say at this point. That's definitely a fear that has been shared by our interviewees, in that they feel that their children will be growing up in a culture that's completely foreign to them personally, and that if they're ever reunited, their children will be unrecognizable to them. As to whether that will be happening, I don't know.
At that table right there on the right-hand side.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Landreth. Covered China for a little while, both here at Asia Society and in Beijing while it was in Beijing. And I'm wondering, this is a question broadly for the AP, everyone from the institution. How has this series of stories played among subscribers outside of this country, across Asia? Has it gotten good play? What about in Pakistan, for instance, just out of curiosity?
I don't know that I can speak to Pakistan specifically, but what we did notice is that this series did not play particularly well in Asia. And we discussed among ourselves why that was. Was that because people were concerned about running it in their media, people who do business with China? Normally, a project about Asia plays well in Asia, or a project about Latin America plays well in Latin America. This didn't do as well as others. And Ian, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or...
No, I think that's one of the conundrums that we face.
I mean, we do find that some media in Asia are very sensitive about stories that are perceived as highly critical of China. Some neighboring countries, the media in some neighboring countries are sensitive toward stories that they perceive as highly critical of China for whatever reasons. But, it got great play across the globe, I think, and perhaps not as good of play in Asia. So I don't know that we know the reasons, but that's what we think, probably.
But again, that's why we try to broaden it beyond, and, broaden it to automakers, or broaden it to clothes manufacturers, or the consumer pipeline, because that's where I think you can start to get some impact.
So, thank you very much. We'll bring the lunchtime talk to a close. I'd like to thank the Elliott family for their continuing support of the prize and of Asia Society's activities, and to the Asia Society for organizing this every year, and to congratulate the AP, Yanan, Marjorie, and everyone here for their amazing work. So they'll be here afterwards if you want to talk with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you.